Julian Hart wasn't the kind of man anyone expected to meet face-to-face. His name echoed in boardrooms, whispered at charity galas, and printed across the covers of architecture magazines that praised his genius but questioned his humanity. At just 37, he had designed buildings that won international awards. Structures so flawless that people wondered if they'd been drawn by machines rather than the hands of a man. Yet behind those accolades was someone who had never learned to share his life with anyone. Julian lived alone in a mansion perched on a quiet hill north of Seattle, a place he had designed down to the last detail. The house was silent, always silent, as if it were a temple built for one purpose: to shield its owner from the chaos of the world. From his bedroom's glass wall, Julian often stood at dawn, watching the city lights fade as morning took over the horizon. He told himself he liked the quiet, that it was necessary for brilliance. But some mornings, the emptiness pressed too hard against his chest. He would turn away, swallow the discomfort, and move on because emotions, to him, were distractions that led only to disappointment. He had never been touched by love, never let a woman into his world, not even briefly. People assumed it was arrogance. Julian told himself it was discipline. 15 miles away, Marissa Lane stirred sugar into her third cup of coffee, trying to ignore the chill of her cramped apartment. The hum of passing trains shook the thin walls, rattling the kitchen cabinets. Her son Eli sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, lining up toy cars in perfect rows, his small brow furrowed in concentration. He was 5, bright and gentle, but he struggled with sensory overload. The world often felt too loud, too fast, too much. Marissa had lost her bakery during the pandemic, then her savings, and now worked odd jobs to stay afloat. Catering gigs, online cooking classes, whatever she could find to keep Eli's therapy sessions within reach. That morning, as she scrolled through job listings, her heart thudded at a post that felt like a lifeline. Private chef needed. Immediate start, $4,500 week. No degree required. Condition, absolute discretion, and silence. Marissa reread it, stunned. It felt too good to be true, but rent was due, bills piled high, and Eli's name sat on a waiting list for occupational therapy. She couldn't afford much longer. She took a deep breath and applied. 3 days later, she stood at the iron gates of 1847 Maple Ridge Drive, Eli's small hand in hers. The air smelled of pine and frost. The mansion beyond the gates rose like a monument, its sharp lines and glass windows reflecting the cold morning light. Eli's faded backpack, the one with SpongeBob that he'd carried since preschool, sagged on his shoulders. Marissa's stomach churned, not just from the cheap coffee she'd gulped down, but from the weight of what this job might mean for them both. A voice crackled through the intercom, flat and without warmth. Enter. The gates opened soundlessly, and Marissa guided Eli up the stone path. The house seemed built to swallow sound, towering ceilings, endless glass, white stone floors that glowed under the soft light. Every step echoed, making Eli shrink closer to her leg. When they reached the grand foyer, she looked up and there he was. Julian stood at the top of a spiral staircase, as still as one of his own sculptures. He was tall, sharp-featured, his dark suit fitting so perfectly it might have been tailored to his very bones. His eyes were a cool gray, his hair neat, not a strand out of place. He descended the stairs without a word, each footstep measured. When he reached them, he didn't offer a handshake, just a nod. Work hours are 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., no music. No unnecessary conversation during meal preparation or service. Phones off during working hours. Do you agree? Marissa nodded, her throat dry. Yes, I understand. But Julian's gaze was piercing. Most people believe they understand silence until they have to live inside it. The words hung between them like a challenge. Marissa didn't answer. She felt Eli press closer, his fingers toying nervously with the hem of her coat. Julian's eyes flicked to the boy. Marissa braced for impatience, but instead saw something she didn't expect. Curiosity, the briefest softening of his expression. This way, Julian said, his voice quieter now. He turned, leading them through a hallway lined with stark black and white photographs of buildings Marissa recognized from magazines. Eli, wide-eyed, suddenly crouched and touched the marble floor, tracing the veins in the stone with a small finger. Eli, Marissa whispered, her voice tight. Please, it's Carrara marble, Julian said, pausing. His tone was gentler than before. The veining follows a mathematical sequence. Rare. Eli looked up, his gaze meeting Julian's, and for the first time since they arrived, Julian's posture eased just slightly. It's beautiful, Eli said softly. Yes, Julian replied, as if surprised by his own answer. It is Heart pounded. She hadn't expected this man, this cold, distant genius, to even notice her son, let alone speak to him with kindness. But in that small moment, something shifted. She didn't know then how fragile Julian's carefully ordered world truly was. She didn't know that the simplest things a boy's wonder, a quiet touch of marble, or a single warm pancake made with love rather than precision, would begin to unravel the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. And as she followed Julian Into the kitchen. Marissa had no idea she was stepping into a story that would change not only their lives, but the meaning of everything Julian Hart thought he knew about love, connection, and the courage to let someone in. The kitchen was unlike anything Marissa had ever seen. Vast, immaculate, with stainless steel counters that gleamed under recessed lighting. Every appliance was top of the line, but there was no sign that anyone had ever cooked a meal here. It felt more like a showroom than a place where food was meant to be made. Julian stood at the far end, arms folded, watching her as if he were evaluating the structure of a bridge or the stability of a skyscraper. The silence pressed in again, heavy and complete, broken only by the soft, uncertain sound of Eli's footsteps as he explored the edges of the room. Careful not to touch anything. Your supplies will be delivered each morning at 5, Julian said at last. You will have 1 hour to prepare breakfast. I expect it on the table at 6 sharp. Lunch at noon, dinner at 7, no deviation. Marissa nodded, trying to appear steady even as her mind raced. She had catered weddings, corporate luncheons, and holiday parties, but never for one person, never in a place like this. And certainly, never under such scrutiny. Do you have any dietary restrictions or preferences? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Julian's expression didn't change. No preferences, no conversation during meals. He turned to leave, but Eli's small voice stopped him. Do you eat pancakes? The question hung there, so innocent, so out of place in the cold grandeur of that kitchen. Julian looked at Eli as if trying to decode a puzzle he hadn't anticipated. I haven't had pancakes since I was a child, he said finally, his voice softer than before. But I suppose I do eat them. Marissa felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this man wasn't as unreachable as he seemed. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eli, oblivious to the tension, tugged at her sleeve. Mommy, can we make pancakes? She smiled down at him, brushing a curl from his forehead. Yes, baby, we can make pancakes. That first breakfast set the tone for what would become the most surprising chapter of their lives. Marissa rose before dawn, her body aching from the hard mattress of the guest quarters, but her mind alert, focused. She sifted flour, cracked eggs, mixed batter by hand. There was something grounding about the familiar motions. When the smell of warm vanilla and butter filled the air, even the cold kitchen seemed to soften. Julian entered precisely at 6. He sat without a word at the long glass dining table that overlooked the pine-covered hills. The plate in front of him held 2 pancakes, golden and imperfect, dotted with fresh berries. He picked up his fork, paused as if puzzled by the sight of the meal, and then took a bite. His face betrayed nothing but when he set the fork down. Marissa thought she saw the slightest crease at the corner of his mouth, as if he might smile but had forgotten how each day followed a rhythm of quiet precision. Marissa cooked Eli, played quietly, and Julian observed them both from a distance, like a man watching a storm form on the horizon, certain whether to brace for disaster or marvel at its beauty. But it was the small, unplanned moments that began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. One afternoon, Eli discovered the garden, or what should have been a garden. The grounds stretched behind the house, perfect rows of trimmed hedges and stone paths, but no flowers, no color, nothing that bloomed. Eli crouched to the ground, tracing patterns in the gravel with a stick, his face scrunched in concentration. Julian stepped onto the patio and watched him, silent as ever. Why don't you have any flowers? Eli asked without looking up. Julian's voice was low, almost reluctant. They're unpredictable, hard to control. Eli considered this, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. But they're pretty, even if they're messy. Julian didn't respond, but that night, long after Marissa had put Eli to bed, she spotted him through the window, standing alone in the garden, hands in his pockets, staring at the empty flower beds as if seeing them for the first time. Marissa noticed other changes, too subtle but impossible to ignore. Julian's footsteps became quieter, less rigid. He lingered a moment longer at the table after meals. Sometimes, she would catch him watching Eli with something that looked almost like wonder. It was as if her son's innocence, his gentle view of the world, had cracked something open in a man who had long ago sealed himself off from feeling. But beneath that quiet shift, Julian battled with himself. Each evening, after they'd gone to their quarters, he walked the vast halls of his home, pacing like a man at war with his own mind. The silence he'd cherished now echoed differently, no longer comforting, but hollow. He found himself listening for the soft sound of Eli's laughter, the hum of Maurice's voice as she read bedtime stories. And when those sounds weren't there, the quiet felt heavier than it ever had before. Julian didn't understand it. He had designed his life to be free from such distractions, convinced that attachment led only to loss. His parents' bitter divorce, the coldness that followed, had taught him that lesson young, but now, here were Marissa and Eli, quietly rearranging the lines of the blueprint he'd drawn for himself. And no matter how much he told himself he didn't need them, his heart had begun to betray him. The true test came on a rainy evening, when a storm swept across the hill. The power flickered, then failed, plunging the house into darkness. Marissa found Julian in the foyer, standing as still as a statue, the storm raging beyond the glass. "I'll find candles," she said. "No," he said quickly. "Come with me." He led her and Eli down to a room Marissa hadn't seen before, a library, its walls lined with books, its hearth empty and cold. Julian knelt, striking a match with steady hands, lighting a fire that slowly filled the room with warmth and light. They sat together in the glow, listening to the storm batter the windows, the silence between them no longer heavy, but peaceful. Eli dozed off against Marissa's side. Julian stared into the flames, his expression thoughtful, almost gentle. "Never wanted anyone here," he said quietly, as if confessing a secret, "but I think I needed someone." Marissa met his gaze, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "Sometimes, we don't know what we need until it finds us." And as the storm raged outside, Julian Hart realized that perhaps, for the first time in his life, he was no longer alone. Morning light crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long golden beams across the polished stone floors. Julian stood alone in the kitchen, his hands resting on the counter where, hours before, Marissa had carefully stacked fresh-baked bread to cool. The scent still lingered, warm and inviting, a reminder of how much his home had changed in such a short time. He hadn't meant to rise this early. Sleep had eluded him, chased away by thoughts that refused to quiet. He couldn't stop hearing Eli's small voice, or seeing the way Marissa's smile softened the edges of every room she entered. The house was no longer just his fortress of silence. Somehow, without his permission, it had become theirs too. Julian picked up a slice of the bread, studied it as if it held answers he couldn't find, and then set it back down. The sound of soft footsteps behind him made him turn. Marissa stood at the doorway, wrapped in a robe, hair slightly mussed from sleep. There was a gentleness in her expression that unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. "Couldn't sleep, either?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not for days now." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Julian felt no need to fill the silence. Somehow it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Marissa moved closer, took a seat at the island counter, and for a moment they simply existed together in that quiet dawn. Listening to the world slowly wake, it was Eli who brought life to the house. Again, as he always did, his small voice echoed down the hall as he recited the names of dinosaurs from memory. Padding into the kitchen still in his pajamas, hair sticking up in every direction, he beamed at Julian as if they'd been friends forever. And before Julian could retreat behind his usual walls, Eli was tugging him down to the floor to help line up toy figurines. That morning marked the first time Julian allowed himself to sit on the cold tile, knees bent awkwardly, listening intently as Eli explained the difference between a triceratops and a and when Eli placed a small plastic dinosaur in his hand, Julian held it as if it were made of glass. Not Marissa watched from the counter, her heart full. The man who once demanded absolute silence was now kneeling on the floor, learning the language of a child who saw wonder in everything. She wondered if Julian realized how much he was changing or if he was fighting it with every breath. Later that day, Julian invited them both to walk the grounds with him. The air was crisp, the sky brushed with soft gray clouds. Eli ran ahead, delighting in the wide open space, while Julian and Marissa followed at a slower pace. "I've been thinking," Julian said after a long stretch of silence, "about the garden. I want to plant flowers. Real ones." Marissa blinked in surprise. "Flowers?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the bare beds that lined the stone paths. "Eli's right. They're unpredictable, but they're also beautiful, and maybe it's time for a little unpredictability." His words hung there, gentle and uncertain, like the first step onto ice that might crack beneath him. Marissa smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "I think that would be wonderful." The days that followed unfolded like a quiet miracle. Julian ordered soil, seeds, and tools. He worked alongside Marissa and Eli, hands in the dirt, learning as he went. There was something almost boyish in his determination. The way he marveled at tiny sprouts pushing through the soil. The way he stayed up late reading about roses, tulips, and wildflowers. The man who once demanded perfection now found joy in messy hands and crooked rows. But not all change comes easily. As the garden grew, so did Julian's fears. Late at night, after Marissa and Eli had gone to sleep, he would walk the garden paths alone, haunted by the thought that none of this was meant for him. He worried that any moment the fragile happiness he'd stumbled upon would shatter, that Marissa would leave, that Eli would stop seeing him as a friend, that he would wake to find it all had been a dream. One evening, Marissa found him sitting, alone on the patio, staring at the stars. She sat beside him, silent at first, letting the night wrap around them like a blanket. Finally, she spoke. "You're afraid," she said gently. Julian didn't deny it. "I don't know how to keep any of it. I spent my whole life building walls, and now I don't know how to live without them." Marissa reached out, resting her hand over his. "You don't have to know how, just let it happen. Let us be here." Her touch, warm and steady, felt like an anchor, and in that moment, Julian made a quiet promise to himself, to try to let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of the love he'd always kept at arm's length. The next morning, Eli raced into the kitchen with a fistful of wildflowers, his face lit up with pride. "These are for you, Julian." Julian knelt, taking the flowers as if they were priceless treasures. "Thank you, Eli. They're perfect." And for the first time, the smile that tugged at Julian's lips wasn't hesitant or fleeting. It was real. Full freedom, as the house filled with laughter, the scent of fresh bread, and the bright colors of the garden. Julian realized he was no longer a man trapped by silence and control. He was a man learning to live, to feel, to hope. And deep down, he knew their story was only just beginning. Julian woke before dawn, standing at the window as the first blush of morning touched the horizon. But this time, something was different. The quiet that once comforted him now felt incomplete. He had grown used to the gentle sounds of life filling his house, Silly's soft humming as he played, Marissa's light footsteps in the kitchen, the clink of plates and the hiss of the stove. Now, in their absence, the silence felt too deep, too hollow. He turned from the window, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a longing he couldn't name. He found himself moving through the house as if searching for something or someone. When he reached the kitchen, he paused. A small vase of wildflowers, Eli's gift from the day before, stood on the counter, bright and cheerful in the pale light. Julian touched one of the petals, marveling at its softness, its imperfection. For years, he'd built his life around precision, structure, and control. Yet here he was, treasuring the fragile beauty of something that couldn't be engineered. The sound of the back door opening drew his attention. Marissa stepped in, cheeks pink from the cool morning air, carrying a basket of fresh herbs and early blooms from the garden. She smiled when she saw him, surprised but glad. "You're up early," she said, setting the basket down. "I couldn't sleep," Julian admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "The house feels different now, and it's quiet. I notice how empty it really was before." Marissa nodded, understanding more than he expected. "It's amazing what we can get used to, isn't it? And how easily the smallest things can change everything." Julian's gaze softened. "I didn't realize how much I needed those small things." Their conversation was interrupted by the patter of small feet. Eli burst into the room, still in his pajamas, his face lighting up when he saw them both. He ran to Julian first, wrapping his arms around his waist in a hug so spontaneous, so pure, that Julian froze for a heartbeat before slowly lowering his hands to return the embrace. The gesture was simple, but to Julian, it felt monumental, as if a door inside him had been opened at last. Later that day, Julian suggested something no one would have expected of him. "Let's go out," he said. "Somewhere together, the three of us." Marissa looked at him in surprise. "Out." He nodded. "There's a place I used to go when I was younger. A park by the water. I haven't been in years, but I think I'd like to share it with you." And so, for the first time in as long as he could remember, Julian left behind his carefully controlled world. They packed a simple lunch, and he drove them down winding roads, toward the coast. The park was quiet, the air filled with the scent of salt and pine. Eli ran ahead, chasing gulls and laughing freely. Marissa spread a blanket beneath a large tree, and they sat together, watching the boys' joy. Julian felt it then, that elusive thing he'd convinced himself didn't exist. For men like him, peace, not the kind that comes from isolation or silence, but the kind that comes from connection, from belonging. He listened to Marissa talk about her dreams of opening another bakery, about the small joys and heartbreaks of her life. He listened, truly listened, and found himself wanting to know more, wanting to be part of her world, not just an observer. But, as the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, Julian felt a flicker of fear. This happiness felt too good, too fragile. What if it slipped through his fingers? What if he couldn't protect it? The drive home was quiet, but not unkind. Julian's mind was full, his heart fuller still. That night, as he stood once more at the window, he made a decision. He wouldn't let fear keep him from what he'd found. He wouldn't retreat behind walls in silence. He would try, truly try, to be the man Marissa and Eli already seemed to believe he could be. But fate, as it often does, had plans of its own. The next morning brought a knock at the door, a rare intrusion. A man in a crisp suit stood on the porch, holding a folder, his expression unreadable. Julian took the envelope offered to him, his fingers tightening as he read the contents. It was a reminder of the world outside his Havana world, where business, obligations, and cold realities waited. A world that didn't care about gardens, or pancakes, or the gentle way a child could heal an old wound. Julian closed the door, his mind racing. Whatever peace he had found felt suddenly at risk. The man he had been, the man of structure and solitude, whispered that this was dangerous, that he was opening himself to pain. But another voice, stronger now, urged him to fight for what he'd begun to build. That night, as the stars emerged, one by one, Julian stepped into the garden. The flowers Eli had planted with him swayed in the breeze, delicate yet resilient. And Julian realized that maybe that was the point. Life wasn't meant to be flawless. It was meant to be felt, in all its mess and wonder. And with that, he knew, the hardest part wasn't letting them in. It would be keeping them there, no matter what storms might come. The storm came faster than Julian could have imagined. Not the kind that darkens the sky and rattles the windows, but the kind that sweeps through a life, threatening everything. In its path, the letter delivered that morning wasn't just a reminder of the world outside, it was a summons. A legal battle over one of his largest architectural projects. A former partner accusing him of breach of contract, demanding millions in damages. It was the kind of fight that could drag on for years, consume his time, his energy, even his reputation. Julian had built his life to avoid chaos, but chaos had found him anyway. He stood in his office staring out at the garden where Eli played, with a small shovel, helping Marissa plant a row of sunflowers. The boys' laughter floated through the open window, light and untripled. It was a sound Julian clung to, a sound he didn't want to lose, but part of him feared it was already slipping away like sand through his fingers. He didn't know how to protect what mattered most without pulling back into the fortress of control he'd spent years constructing. That evening, Marissa found him in the library, the fire unlit, the room heavy with shadows. She stepped inside, quietly, sensing the weight in the air. "What's happened?" she asked gently. Julian hesitated, then handed her the letter. As she read, he watched the flicker of worry cross her face, but when she looked up at him, her expression was steady. "We'll get through this," she said simply. Julian almost laughed softly, bitterly. "There's no we in this, Marissa. This is my battle, my mess. I should have known better than to believe I could keep this life separate from the one I left behind." Marissa stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Don't you see? That's what you've always done. You built a world of walls, and you locked yourself inside. But Julian, people aren't meant to live like that. Let us be with you, and let us help." Her words stirred something in him, something fragile and hopeful, but fear was louder. Fear told him that dragging Marissa and Eli into his storm would only hurt them, so he did what he thought was right. He tried to distance himself. In the days that followed, Julian threw himself into meetings, calls, strategies. He worked late into the night, often returning to the house after Eli was asleep and Marissa was alone in the kitchen, cleaning up the day's dishes. He stopped joining them for meals, stopped walking in the garden, stopped sitting by the fire as Eli recited facts about dinosaurs or taught him the names of flowers they'd planted together at first. Eli waited for him at the table, in the garden, at the window. But as the days passed, the boys' hopeful glances turned to puzzled ones. Marissa tried to fill the gaps, but she saw the change in Julian. Saw how the weight of his old world was pulling him away from the new one they had begun to build together. One night, long after midnight, Julian stood at his office window, staring out at the darkened garden. The flowers they had planted were beginning to bloom, bright spots of color even in the moonlight, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself feel what he had tried so hard to suppress: the ache of missing them, the loneliness that his success had never filled, the quiet that no longer brought him peace. The next morning, Julian did something he hadn't done in years. He stepped away from his work. He canceled meetings. He turned off his phone, and he went looking for Marissa and Eli. He found them at the edge of the garden, where Eli was showing Marissa how tall his sunflowers had grown. Julian watched for a moment, unnoticed, feeling like an outsider in his own life. But then Eli spotted him and ran toward him, arms wide, as if no time had passed at all. Julian knelt, catching the boy in his arms, holding him tightly. The simple act nearly undid him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to go away." Marissa approached, her eyes shining with relief and something deeper understanding. "You don't have to do this alone, Julian. Whatever comes, we're here, but you have to let us be." Julian drew a shaky breath, realizing at last that pushing them away had done nothing to protect them more himself. It had only made him lonelier. And for what? A battle he couldn't win with isolation. He looked at Marissa, at Eli, at the garden they had made together, and he knew the truth. He had already found what mattered most. Now he had to fight to keep it, not with walls, but with open hands, with trust, with the courage to let them stand beside him. That evening, for the first time in weeks, they shared dinner together. The meal was simple pasta with fresh herbs. From the garden, but to Julian, it felt like a feast. The sound of Eli's laughter, the warmth of Marissa's smile, the soft glow of candles flickering against the night, it was everything he had been missing, everything he hadn't known how to ask for. And as he listened, truly listened, to the small, ordinary joys of the people he loved, Julian realized that the greatest victory wouldn't come from winning lawsuits or protecting his fortune. It would come from holding on to the messy, beautiful, unpredictable life they were building together. Julian woke to the soft light of dawn spilling across his bedroom. But for the first time in a long while, it wasn't work or worry that filled his mind. It was the sound of Eli's laughter from the garden, carried on the breeze through his open window. It was the memory of Marissa's eyes the night before, kind and steady as she reminded him that he wasn't alone. Something inside him felt lighter, as if the weight he'd carried for so long had finally shifted, just enough for him to breathe. He dressed without his usual deliberation, drawn by the pull of something far stronger than his routines or responsibilities, simple, unshakable desire to be present. When he stepped outside, the garden greeted him with the scent of earth and new blooms. Eli stood beside a row of sunflowers, holding a watering can nearly as big as he was, drenching the plants with more enthusiasm than precision. Marissa knelt nearby, her hands deep in the soil, coaxing young herbs into place. They both looked up when Julian approached, and in their smiles, he found more warmth than any sunrise could offer. "Good morning," Marissa said, her voice soft, but full of welcome. Julian nodded, then surprised them both. "May I help?" Ely's face lit up. "You can water the sunflowers, Julian. They're really thirsty." Julian took the can from him, feeling its awkward weight, and carefully began to pour. The water splashed onto his polished shoes, but he didn't care. The boy's delight, the way Marissa's gaze softened as she watched him try these things, mattered so much more. For hours, they worked together, planting, weeding, laughing. The garden became a place of peace, not perfection, a symbol of the life they were nurturing. Messy and beautiful and entirely real. And as the sun climbed higher, Julian felt a sense of belonging he'd never known. Here, in this small corner of the world, he wasn't a millionaire, or a man defined by lawsuits and contracts. He was just a man, learning, growing, becoming. But even as this new chapter unfolded, the storm of his legal battle still brewed beyond the garden walls. The news made headlines, the accusations casting long shadows. Calls poured in from journalists, former colleagues, even distant relatives he hadn't heard from in years. The pressure was relentless. But this time, Julian didn't retreat behind silence. He faced it with the same quiet strength he had found tending the garden, drawing courage from the people beside him. One morning, as he prepared to leave for a crucial meeting with his lawyers, Marissa stopped him at the door. "Whatever happens today," she said, "remember what's waiting for you here. Don't let them take this from you." Her words stayed with him through every tense discussion, every hard decision. And when the dust finally began to settle, when the worst of the battle was behind him and the outcome far better than he'd feared, Julian knew why he'd made it through. It wasn't his fortune or his brilliance that had saved him. It was love. The love that had quietly entered his life in the form of a boy's wonder and a woman's unwavering kindness. The love that had given him something worth fighting for, something no lawsuit could touch. That evening, he came home not as a man weary from war, but as a man eager to return to what mattered. Ely ran to meet him at the gate, arms wide, voice bright. Marissa stood on the porch, waiting, her smile like a light in the dusk, and Julian, without hesitation, swept Ely into his arms, then crossed to Marissa and took her hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for seeing who I could be, not just who I was." Marissa's eyes shone. "You found him yourself, Julian. We just walked beside you." From that day forward, Julian lived differently. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. It rang with laughter, with conversation, with the quiet sounds of a life shared. The garden flourished, wild and colorful, a testament to the beauty of letting go of control. Julian learned to cook pancakes the way Ely liked them, messy with too many berries. He learned to listen, to play, to hope. End every night, as the stars filled the sky above their hill. He stood in the garden, looking at all they had built together, and felt what he had once thought impossible. Peace, not from solitude, but from love. Their story wasn't one of grand gestures or flawless plans. It was a story of small moments, of walls slowly coming down, of a man who had never touched love until he found it in the simplest of places, in a garden, in a child's hug, in a woman's steady hand. A story of a life transformed not by wealth or success, but by the courage to let his heart be seen. And so, Julian Hart, the man who had once believed he needed nothing, and no one, discovered that the greatest architecture he would ever design wasn't made of steel or glass or stone. It was the life he built, imperfect and beautiful, with the family he never knew he was searching for.